أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة قالوا إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
We began our discussion a few nights ago looking at the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala translates the complexity of existence into palpable stories that we can look at, relate to, and then change ourselves based upon. And the height of these stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives in the Quran are that of role models. And we will continue in that vein in tonight's discussion, looking at one of the greatest role models in all of human history. And that is none other than Bibi Zainab. Now, it's important as well, and I mentioned this when we were talking about both Bibi Asiya and Bibi Maryam alayhim salam, that when we talk about female figures of history, great female figures of history, they are great in their own right. They have this station by their own merit, not just by association. And they are a role model for all, both men and women. Yes, there are certain parts of their lives which are more relatable to our sisters. But by and large, they are role models for everyone. And Bibi Zainab, she's unique in one respect, in that no matter what background you come from, no matter what faith you belong to, no matter what religion you ascribe to, Bibi Zainab's life is so inspirational that nobody would be able to read her biography without being inspired. Even if you remove all of the religious elements, even if we take out everything to do with Islam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, still you have the story of one of the most patient, one of the bravest, one of the most incredible human beings who has ever walked this earth. And yet, she is unfortunately known by so few, a minority within a minority. But the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi,
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
he tells us in a tradition recorded in Zainab al-Kubra, a book I'll refer to a few times tonight, he says that to weep for the calamities of Zainab is the same as to weep for the calamities of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhim salam. Her azadari is equal to that of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. And her story begins, of course, with her birth. And Hazrat Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi,
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
he recited the adhan in her right ear, the iqamah in the left, as is the tradition when we have newborns. But then it came to naming her. Bibi Fatima alayha salam took her newborn and said, Ya Ali, name her. Imam Ali alayhi salam said, I cannot precede Rasulullah in this. So he took Bibi Zainab, said, Ya Rasulullah, name her. Rasulullah says, I cannot precede my Lord Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at that moment, Jibreel came down and said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed that her name will be Zainab.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And this was the first time that the news about what was going to happen to her and the tragedies that she would have to face came down. And at the time of her birth, the Holy Prophet shed tears for her. And the name Zainab, it comes from Zinat Abiha, which means the adornment, the treasure of her father, Imam Ali. And we will see throughout this discussion, inshallah, about the many ways in which she reflected the qualities of her father. And the first majlis for Imam Hussein alayhi salam was, of course, conducted by Rasulullah. Because at the birth of each of these great individuals, you find that the Holy Prophet would remember them and Jibreel would give information about their fate. And he would cry for them. And the same happened, of course, at the birth of Bibi Zainab. And her upbringing was unique. Because she was brought up in the same household that raised two imams, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And she was brought up, of course, by none other than Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And Rasulullah spoke very highly of his family, both in terms of a personal sense but also in a religious sense. In that famous hadith of Thaqalain, recorded in many books of a hadith, but to quote one, Sahih Muslim, book 31, hadith 5920, the Holy Prophet says, I leave behind you two weighty things, two precious things in this tradition, the Quran and my Ahlul Bayt. And Bibi Zainab, although she was quite young when he passed away, she remembered him very fondly. And he had a profound impact on her life and on her personality. Because she records, as is recorded in As-Sayyida Zainab, she said that none is like my grandfather, the Arab, the Hashemite, and the Qurayshite prophet, who has been selected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, elevated and guiding the people about goodness, and he did so with a handsome approach, with pleasantries, with articulation and statements of softness, tenderness, sympathy, and compassion. That was the way the Holy Prophet would spread his message. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he would manifest his message. He would display it in his character before he would tell people what to do. And there's an important point here to learn. Because when we think about raising children, what we tend to put most focus on is what we tell kids. Right? We think that they should listen to everything that we say, and we keep emphasizing over and over again. But kids are much better at copying what they see than doing what they hear. So if we spend our lives telling our kids one thing, but we are hypocrites and we act in the opposite way, then there is friction and it causes issues. And she was, of course, brought up in the house of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhim as-salam. And they showed her the utmost respect. Whenever, for example, they would, Bibi Zainab, she would go to visit the grave of Rasul al-A'zam, they would go with her, and Imam Ali as well. And when they would go to the grave to mourn, Imam Ali would put out the candle so that there was no light, that Bibi Zainab's hijab would be fully protected. She felt very strongly about her hijab, as we will go on to see later on. That is one of her most powerful legacies. And of course, she is brought up by Imam Ali alayhi salam. And what a household to be brought up in. And imams, very often, they would send questioners, certain questioners, especially if they were women, who would come to them, they would send them to their female counterparts, saying that whatever answer you will get from me, you will get the same level, the same truth you will get from this lady. So, for example, we have Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, who would send questioners to his wife, Lady Hamida. Imam al-Askari alayhi salam would send people to Lady Hakima. And of course we have the famous Ma'suma Qum, the sister of Imam Rada alayhi salam, after whom the great Hawza in Qum is named. And the same way Imam Ali alayhi salam would send people to Bibi Zainab. When Imam Ali had established his teaching centers in Kufa, when he moved the Islamic capital to Kufa, and he would teach openly in the mosques, Bibi Zainab would teach in her home. And she would teach from all different backgrounds. Many different intellectual disciplines she would cover. And Imam Ali alayhi salam planted this desire for intellectual aspiration within her from a young age. And from when she was very young, she showed signs of this. And Ibn Hajar, the famed Sunni scholar, he writes, he calls her Al-Aqilatul Aqila, the most superior of intellect. So when Imam Ali alayhi salam was teaching her numbers, this is in Rayahin al-Sharia, he asked Zainab, say 1. And she said 1. He said, oh Zainab, say 2. And she didn't answer. Imam Ali said, Zainab, say 2. And Bibi Zainab replied, how can the tongue that has said 1 now say 2? The tongue that has borne witness to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can it go and talk about multiplicity? And how young, her age isn't referenced in this tradition, but if Imam Ali is talking to her about counting, you can only imagine how young she must be. In another tradition recorded in Zainab al-Kubra, Imam Ali alayhi salam is approached by Bibi Zainab, and she asks him, "O father, do you love us?" Imam Ali alayhi salam looks at her and says, "Of course, you are the flower of our hearts. Of course we love you." And Bibi Zainab corrected him and said, "No, actually all love is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What you have for us is compassion."
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
She recognizes the different types and the different layers of love. And when Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam would have their intellectual discussions, Bibi Zainab was there as well. She would intervene, she would give her due. So for example, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam were discussing a tradition about the Holy Prophet, talking about halal and haram. And Bibi Zainab, she gave her opinion. And she said that the halal is halal, haram is haram. And in between are dubious matters. And to avoid the dubious matters is the acquittal of religion and honor and purity for both, since it achieves the sincere religion. Ala lillahi dinul khalis, quoting the Holy Quran. To Allah, the sincere obedience, the sincere deen, religion is due. And for those who follow the lines of the dubious matters, it is not safe. Why? Because if we live life on the edge, she goes on to say, the feet can slip and thus they might commit an unlawful deed.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So whenever we have a matter we're not sure about, is it halal, is it haram, somewhere in the middle, where we can take precaution. It is best to do precaution. Because even if you're probably right, one slip up and you end up in the haram. Whereas if you try and avoid dubious matters with some ihtiyat, then when you slip up, you're still within the boundaries of halal. And you can see Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they respected her. They wanted her contributions in their discussions. They valued her opinion. They involved her and they showed how important her opinion was. And this was the household that showed us the relation of siblings, between brothers and sisters, that we respect one another. We show one another their due. We validate one another's opinions, regardless of their age, regardless of their gender, whatever else it might be. And a testimony to the way in which she followed Imam Ali alayhi salam was that during the time of the Umayyad Khilafah, Imam Ali alayhi salam's name, just on a side note, on a tangent, Imam Ali alayhi salam's name, it became very dangerous. People didn't want to name their children after Imam Ali because they were afraid of governmental sanction. When you would narrate traditions, you wouldn't want to say the name of Imam Ali because it could cause you trouble. And from the mimbars, Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi,
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
he was cursed. When people would recite Salat al-Jumu'ah or when they would go up to give a talk, Imam Ali alayhi salam was cursed. And this is not a controversial fact of history. The sources are there. Just to quote a few before we return. In Sahih Muslim, book 31, hadith 5915, Muawiyah asks Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, conversation between two companions, why don't you curse, why don't you abuse Abu Turab? Meaning Imam Ali alayhi salam. It was one of his kunniyas, one of his titles. And of course, Imam Ali alayhi salam, who is the greatest of companions, the closest to the Holy Prophet, what kind of an absurd question is this unless there is a context of cursing? So within the Sahihain, there is an indirect reference to it, number one. And within the historical sources, there are many direct references. We find it in Tarikh al-Tabari, in volume 18, page 123, in the English translation, that Muawiyah gives advice to Mughira. And in page 149, he talks about it as a condition of release. And in Shibli Numani's historical work, he talks about the fact that for about 90 years, Imam Ali alayhi salam was cursed from the minbars. So it was an established practice. It is one of those historical facts that's a little bit less convenient. So we don't tend to hear about it as much. But it happened. And in that time, how would they narrate from Imam Ali alayhi salam? They would say the father of Zainab has reported. That was how much her likeness was to her father. And it shows us, and Bibi Zainab is an example of the importance of female education. Because when we educate ourselves, when we go out and learn both the religious sciences but also the secular ones, we arm ourselves with an ability to have some sort of control over our futures and our fates. Because we know about our rights, we know about what options we have going forward. We're not limited purely to everything what other people have decided for us. And that is why in very misogynistic scenarios, in particular, we can see it recently with the Taliban and what they're doing in Afghanistan, the first thing that they're doing is they're firing women from positions wherever they go. It was only yesterday that they took over a town and they got rid of every female banker. Why? Because they want to keep women subjugated. They don't want women to be educated so that they can't speak up for their own rights. But as we saw in the example of Bibi Zainab, and we'll go on to see, she was the loudest when it came to speaking for her rights. And there's no barrier to knowledge, be it gender, be it age, be it distance, be it source. All from the prophetic sunnah. And of course, Bibi Zainab, she was also brought up by her mother, Lady Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And she learned from her mother, both in those close, tender moments that a mother and daughter may share. On one occasion, it's a beautiful tradition that she saw her mother praying during the night, long period of time, and she's doing dua for everyone. And right at the end of her prayers, eventually she comes and she prays for her own family. And Bibi Zainab approaches her and says, "Oh mother, why is it that you pray for others before us?" And Bibi Fatima, she responded with that famous Arab adage, "Ajar thumma dar," the neighbor, then one's household. And these are the ways, this is how we teach kids, by practicing. And kids are tuned in more than you might think, even when you think they're not listening, even when you think they're not looking, even when you think they might not be receptive. Their antennas are always active. But apart from those moments with her mother, which were tender, there were also moments which were a lot more difficult. But again, she would learn. And she saw her mother take up staunch political stances. Mubahila, for example, with the Holy Prophet, as Allah immortalized in the Quran, Surah Al Imran, verse number 61. And also, when Fadak was taken from her, Bibi Fatima, she went out and she spoke out against the Khalif of her time, demanding her right. And it shows again the importance of prominence, the importance of being able to stand up for one's rights. And there are so many parallels we find between the sermon of Bibi Fatima and the sermons of Bibi Zainab. Unfortunately, it's beyond the scope of tonight's discussion. But when you look at the two, you can see like mother, like daughter. But again, Bibi Zainab, she shows us that hijab does not prevent a lady from entering into society. If she wants to, whatever a woman's choice is. But if she chooses to go out, she wants to establish her career, she wants to speak up for her rights, she wants to enter politics, whatever it might be. She has the right from an Islamic perspective. But of course, there are rules of modesty. And she saw tragedy after tragedy. She saw her mother's oppression. And she was there with her mother during these times. And she would see as her mother would cry in Baytul Ahzan, in that house of sorrows. And she would see that Bibi Fatima would go to the tomb of Rasulullah and would throw herself upon it and cry about what the Prophet's ummah had done to her. But after the passing of her mother, she went on to marry Hazrat Abdullah ibn Ja'far. And this is the son of Ja'far al-Tayyar. And he is the same Ja'far, the brother of Imam Ali alayhi salam, who was martyred at the Battle of Mu'tah. and the one about whom the Holy Prophet said after he was martyred, as Waqidi reports, that he flies in Jannah with his two wings. And Hazrat Abdullah, he was no less noble than his father. Even his enemies would praise him. Muawiyah, for example, in Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's work, he mentions the fact that Abdullah is worthy of all honor. He preceded all in terms of good deeds and qualities. And Hazrat Abdullah deeply loved Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He was not able to be there in Karbala, unfortunately, due to infirmity and, according to some traditions, due to his eyesight. But after Imam Hussein was martyred, he would constantly speak about the praises of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And sometimes his servants would say, you talk about Imam Hussein so much. And Hazrat Abdullah would just say that I wish I could have been there with Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. But at least the redeeming fact is that both my sons were martyred alongside him. And when Imam Hussein alayhi salam came to Bibi Zainab and asked for her help, Hazrat Abdullah ibn Ja'far allowed her to go because they're a family unit. And it hurt him deeply, but she went. And when Imam Hussein alayhi salam approached Bibi Zainab, it was not in a normal sense. It wasn't just a brother asking for help from his sister. It wasn't just Imam Hussein alayhi salam asking from Bibi Zainab. It was actually the entire institution of Imamah requesting the help of Bibi Zainab.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Imam Hussein alayhi salam knew to what he was marching to. And Bibi Zainab also knew, because her mother told her, the Holy Prophet told her. And throughout the journey, Imam Hussein alayhi salam would recite that verse of the Quran, Surah Qasas, verse number 21, quoting Nabi Musa alayhi salam, قَالَ رَبِّ نَجِّنِي مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. My Lord, deliver me from the unjust people. And there were signs over and over again that the Imam knew what he was marching to. When he was about to leave Medina, he asked the poet Farazdaq, as Tabari reports. He asks, what is the situation with the people of Kufa? He responds in a beautiful line. He says that their hearts are with you, but their swords are against you. And it seems it was the same with his father, Imam Ali, the same with his brother, Imam Hassan, and of course with him towards Karbala. And there were good people in Medina who were trying to convince the Imam not to go because they knew what was going to happen. They knew that if Imam Hussein alayhi salam went out, he would be killed. So one of the good companions, one of the great companions of the Holy Prophet, Hazrat Abdullah ibn Abbas, great narrator of ahadith, he approaches the Imam. He tries to convince him not to go. But the Imam obviously knows what he doesn't know. And after seeing that the Imam will not concede, he says, at least leave your family. Because you know what fate you are marching to. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he says, I cannot leave them, for surely this family is an amana from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And as is recorded in Madinat al-Majiz, Bibi Zainab approached Abdullah ibn Abbas and she said with tears in her eyes, Son of Abbas, do you really suggest that our leader leaves us and he goes off alone? No. By Allah, we will either live with him or we will die with him. There is nothing left without him.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
She loves him as a brother, but she follows him as an Imam. And why did Imam Hussein alayhi salam take his family? Well, there are two basic reasons. The first and the more commonly known answer is that Imam Hussein alayhi salam was not marching off to war. He was marching off to make a statement. And so when he goes towards Kufa, he hasn't gone with an army. He is just a traveler in a strange land. And it shows to anybody who looks at posterity, anyone who looks in history and analyzes those events, they know that Imam Hussein alayhi salam was standing up for truth and for righteousness, for at least from a value-based perspective. So to quote one example, Charles Dickens in the Miscellanies, a magazine that he would write, he is quoted as saying, if Hussein fought to quench his worldly desires, then I do not understand why his sisters, wives, and children accompanied him. It stands to reason, therefore, that he sacrificed purely for Islam. It shows a purity that penetrates through history. Very often you'll find that as time passes on, people will try and pollute what has happened. They'll try and find excuses. For Yazid, for example, because he is one of the tabi'een, which means he's the son of the Sahaba, so he's the next generation after the Sahaba. There are some who are theologically bound to the idea that he must be a good person. And so they try and find whatever excuse they can to try and clear him of sin. And if Imam Hussein alayhi salam was in the desert without the women and children, and if the emotion of the event hadn't been so profound, then their propaganda perhaps would have worked. Because people without expertise, they'd say, okay, one person wanted power, another person was already in power, that was it. But even to the casual observer, they know now that it is between haqq and batil, number one. And number two, Sheikh Allama Abdul Wahid Mudaffar, he argues that the other reason Imam took his family is because there was no depths to the callousness of Yazid. He had no boundaries, he had no limits. This is the same man, by the way, the same Yazid, who the year afterwards, he's only in Khilafah for 3 years, about 3 years. And he commits 3 great crimes. One is, of course, Karbala, the first one. He also sends his army to Mecca, where they burn down the Kaaba. And he sends his army to Medina, where they ransack the city and they commit crimes even within the masjid of the Holy Prophet. So if Yazid was going to go to these lengths, then if Imam left his family there, then there was no guarantee they wouldn't have been imprisoned and used as a political bargaining chip. But Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he knows what fate he is heading towards, and he would constantly allude to it. He would recite some poetry about, for example, time. Just one example: time, shame upon you as a friend. At the day's dawning and the sun setting, how many a companion or seeker will be a corpse? Time will not be satisfied with any substitute. The matter will rest with Allah, and every living creature will have to join me eventually. And Bibi Zainab, she knew what these words meant. Imam is referring to his impending death. And there was anxiety. Bibi Zainab was anxious before the events of Karbala. There are a number of traditions where she would ask Imam Hussein alayhi salam, what will we do without you? And Imam Hussein kept asking her to be patient. And goodness, was she a manifestation of patience. And in Karbala, her heroism was unrivaled. She was the mouthpiece for the side of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Even within Karbala, on the day of Ashura, she made people cry. Sheikh al-Mufid, he records that she said to Umar ibn Sa'ad that woe upon you, Aba Abdullah is being killed and you were watching over him. And then she would call out to the people, is there not a Muslim amongst you? And the way that she struck at the conscience of a man as cold as Umar ibn Sa'ad, some traditions say that there was a tear in his eye as he turned away. And she saved Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam twice in Karbala. Once when the tent was burning, Imam as-Sajjad was too weak, too sick to be able to get up and take himself out. Bibi Zainab was the one who took him out. And the second time, as is recorded in Tarikh Qaramani, that Shimr ibn al-Dhiljawshan, he said, I will kill this Ali ibn al-Hussein. Of course, Imam as-Sajjad's name was Ali. And Hamid ibn Muslim, he said, you will kill a young man? You will kill someone who is so sick? And Shimr didn't care. He ignored Hamid ibn Muslim and he charged towards Imam Zain al-Abidin, who of course couldn't defend himself. But Bibi Zainab, she ran forward. She threw herself on top of the fourth Imam and said, the only way you're going to kill him is if you first kill me. And at that point, Shimr, he turned away. For whatever reason, he must have been scared at seeing the resolve in her eyes. And of course, on Sham-e Ghariba as well, Bibi Zainab, she was the one who went after the runaway children when everyone was scattered and the children were being burnt and trampled under the horses. She was the one who went round gathering everyone. She was the one who went to the broken mothers and consoled them and looked after the crying children. And of course, in the evening when there was no one to look after them, for Hazrat Abbas was no more, she was their protector, their guardian. And she still found it in her to pray Salatul Layl, though of course she did so sitting down. She was an inspiration. Anyone who looked on her, anyone who was losing their sensibilities, they would simply look at Bibi Zainab and they were inspired to go on. That was how seminal she was. And when they were leaving Karbala the following day, Bibi Zainab recites the first majlis of hers. Because I would argue the first majlis ever, the first azadari, the first tears were from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But here, after Karbala, she was responsible for the first, as is recorded in Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya by Ibn Kathir. She says, O Muhammad, this is Hussein, who lies in the wilderness, washed in his own blood, his body shred to pieces, and these are your daughters held as hostages, and your progeny has been taken prisoner. And so profound were those words, and so deep her emotion, that people around, even the enemies who were responsible for killing them, who were responsible for taking them as prisoners, they began to weep and they began to cry. Such was the eloquence of Bibi Zainab. And she teaches us sabr. She teaches us patience, and she teaches us the power of tawakkul. And the verses that I recited at the beginning, Surah Baqarah, verses 155 to 156, we will certainly test you with fear and famine and loss of property and life and crops, and give good news to those who patiently endure. Those who, when afflicted with a calamity, say, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And this was Bibi Zainab. She was a physical manifestation of this verse of the Quran. Everywhere they went after Karbala, from town to town, she was there on the front lines, doing her best whilst in chains to protect the women. And she maintained their dignity even when traveling, because Ahlul Bayt, they were not allowed to have sadaqah. So when people, even out of compassion, would try and give them sadaqah, Bibi Zainab, she would hold off. No matter how desperate the situation, she would still follow the fiqh of her grandfather. And we're not on the Masaib yet, but what can we say when we look at the life of Bibi Zainab? Because it is nothing but musibah. She is Ummul Masaib. And when she goes to the court of Ibn Ziyad, we then see how she reflects her mother, Lady Fatima Zahra. Because when she gives her sermon there, and the sermon she gives in the court of Ibn Ziyad and in the court of Yazid, they are different. It is not like she's just saying the same words over and over again. This is Bibi Zainab we're talking about. She is the daughter of Imam Ali alayhi salam. The one who would give sermons, they would ask him to give a sermon without any dots, letters without dots, letters without alif. Imam Ali would do so straight away. Of course, Bibi Zainab was going to tailor her sermons so that they were perfect for the moment. So Ibn Ziyad. In Ibn Ziyad's court, they were in Kufa, which means that they were surrounded by people. The people in his court were the same people who had some sympathy with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They were the ones who had called the Imam. They had sent the letters to the Imam. So she plays on that. She says, quote, do you shed tears? May your tears never dry up and your loud lamentations never cease. You are like the woman that unravels to bits the thread that she has firmly spun. Your faith is but deceit and betrayal. Are there any amongst you but the immodest, the disgraced, the proud, the spiteful, the adulator, the enemy, the reviler? Do cry endlessly and laugh little, for your deed is so disgraceful, you will never be able to atone for it. How will you be able to wash away the sin of murdering the scion of the seal of the prophets, the essence of the message, the master of the youth of paradise, the refuge of the nobles, the refuge you sought during affliction, the divine proof of Allah, your master who defended the prophet's tradition? What an awful sin you have committed. Away with you, for there will be no forgiveness.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And these are not the words of someone who is defeated. These are not the words of someone who has been humiliated. She stands there with the utmost pride, the utmost resilience, and she utters them. And in such a fashion that Ibn Ziyad could not interrupt her. He couldn't stop her. This was his court. He was the governor. He had just been victorious, right, at Karbala. Yet he can't even control one of his prisoners. And witnesses who were there, they said that we have not heard a speech like this since the speeches of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And she then goes on to deliver what may well be and could easily be argued to be the most powerful line uttered in the entirety of human history. Ibn Ziyad tries to taunt her, thinks that she has been abased, And he says, how do you find what God has done to your household? She looks up and she said, ما رأيت إلا جميلا.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
That I saw nothing but beauty. And the depths of this statement, the power of tawakkul required for Bibi Zainab to look past the severed limbs and the rivers of blood and the tears of the children, to look past all of that, to penetrate the veils between this world and the next, to see the divine light of God in all of the actions in Karbala. Only then can Bibi Zainab say, ما رأيت إلا جميلا.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
And she manifests the teachings of the Quran. Again, she is showing the people, the Holy Prophet, he left behind what? Thaqalain, Quran and Ahlul Bayt. And she shows with this line so firmly that on the one hand, in the Quran, you had the theme of tyrants, you had also the theme of the oppressed. And she shows which is which in the court of Ibn Ziyad. And again, in the court of Ibn Ziyad, she saved Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Because the governor, Ibn Ziyad, he tried to humiliate the fourth Imam. So he said, who is this man who is in chains? And he introduced himself, he said, I am Ali ibn al-Hussein. And Ibn Ziyad, he responded, he said, I thought God killed Ali ibn Hussein. So Imam Zainul Abidin, he replied, that was my brother, Ali al-Akbar. I am also Ali ibn al-Hussein, and it was man who killed him. And Ibn Ziyad said, no, it wasn't man, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Imam Zainul Abidin responded with that verse of Surah Zumar, verse 42, Allahu yatawaffa al-anfusa hina mawtiha. God receives the souls at their times of death. So he turns Ibn Ziyad's argument on its head by way of Quran, because these are the living, walking, talking Qurans. And Ibn Ziyad, he felt the depth of that humiliation. He said, kill him. He said, cut off his head. You will never disrespect me again. They were going forward, and again Bibi Zainab, she ran forward, she threw herself on top of it. And she said, if you are going to kill him, first you must kill me. And sometimes the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, they witness such high value, such lofty spirits, that even they accidentally utter words of praise for Ahlul Bayt. Because at that moment, Ibn Ziyad, he says how wonderful this family relation. This is in Tariq Ibn Athir. He looks at Bibi Zainab and her devotion for Imam Zainul Abidin, and even though he's the one who has killed her family, he can't help but marvel at Bibi Zainab. And he says, leave her alone. And Bibi Zainab, she is then taken, of course, to the court of Yazid. And now the context is different, because these are no longer the people of Kufa. She is now in Syria. These are the people who have been brainwashed. Muawiyah has been working with his system of propaganda for some time now. And so the people of Syria, they don't recognize the position of Ahlul Bayt. And these people who've come in, they think they're just random prisoners of war. And that is how Yazid wants to paint the picture, because Yazid is now in the position to paint the narrative. Controlling the narrative is essential when it comes to trying to either protect your image or to spread a message. And when Yazid made that statement, as Ibn Kathir records in Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, that he wished that his ancestors from Badr were there. He had made a statement of kufr. In what respect? Because at Badr, his ancestors were the ones who were fighting against the Holy Prophet, who wanted to extinguish the light of Islam. But it was the Holy Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam and all of the companions of the Prophet who fought back. So when Bibi Zainab responds in the sermon, we'll see a couple of extracts. She responds to show that it is not a case of Ahlul Bayt versus Banu Umayyah, but it is a case of Islam versus Kufr. She says in her sermon, a few extracts, again, we're running a bit short on time, but her sermon is truly beautiful. She says, O Yazid, do you think it is a matter of pride for you that you have captured us between the heavens and the earth and made us driven like slaves, and that it is a disgrace to us? Does all this make you rejoice, that you feel you have prepared the world for yourself? You imagine that everything is arranged properly and that the kingdom and country are now in your favor. And this was exactly what Yazid was thinking. Exactly. He wouldn't have boasted as such otherwise. He thought that his material victory was a proof of his righteousness. Bibi Zainab, she reminds him, she says, take respite. But you have forgotten the verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those who have become deniers should not imagine. Those whom we have been given respite must not think that that respite is good for them. We have verily give them respite that they may go on adding to their sins, and for them there will be a painful chastisement.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
He wanted his material success to be a proof of his righteousness. Bibi Zainab paradigm shift showed no, actually your success is a proof of your wrongfulness. And she, again, people are brainwashed. They don't know about the history of Yazid. In that court, she says, what kind of hope can be entertained from the son of the one who chewed the liver of the noble and whose flesh was nourished by the blood of the martyrs? Allahu Akbar. In Yazid's court, in the bastion of his propaganda, in the heart of his empire, Bibi Zainab stands up and she shows the world who this man really is. Because Yazid is the son of Hind, but the grandson. And she turns around this system of honor. That he thought that he had this station, he wanted to establish it for his name, and Bibi Zainab says, you're not going to get away with that. Another portion of her speech, she says, O Yazid, very soon you will join them on that day, and you will wish, alas, would that I had been paralyzed, that I could not have said what I said, that I could not have done what I had done. O Yazid, sufficient for us it is that Allah is the judge, and Muhammad is the witness, and the avenger of blood, and Jibreel will be his supporter.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And one of the principles we established, by the way, is that when we look at history, we like to look at evidence, and sometimes from a three-dimensional perspective as well. When Bibi Zainab gave this sermon, we say that she terrified Yazid. She absolutely terrified him to his very core. What is the evidence? Not only do we get the evidence from the direct interactions, we also get the evidence that he eventually released them. But more importantly, when Yazid went to Medina and he ransacked the city of the Prophet, Medina al-Munawwara, what did he say? In the same place where he took animals inside the mosque of the Holy Prophet, and I can't go into the details of the crimes, it wouldn't be appropriate here. What did Yazid say? He said, leave the house of Ahlul Bayt alone. Marwan ibn al-Hakam, the Khalif who was going to succeed Yazid, well, after Yazid's son Muawiyah would disavow his father and the Khilafah, Marwan, the right hand of Uthman, he had to go to the house of Imam Zain al-Abidin and say, look, they're ransacking Medina, please give us sanctuary. He was so terrified of Lady Zainab, he wouldn't even let his armies go near her. And Bibi Zainab, she recites that verse of the Quran, Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil, Allah is sufficient for us and the best of executors. And how surprised they must have been in the court. Not just Yazid, but everybody who was there. Because she was defeated, right? She was from the losing camp. No. She was supposed to be one who had been worn down by the tragedies of Karbala, the difficulties of the journey, and the supposed humiliation in the court of Ibn Ziyad. This wasn't the way the narrative was supposed to go. She still has the energy to destroy a khilafah with her words. And in her sermon, she also finds space to mention the hijab as well. And again, this is so seminal. We spent more time talking about it when we were talking about Bibi Maryam alayhi salam. But again, in the sermon of Bibi Zainab, where she can be cut off at any moment, where these words will be immortalized forever, she devotes a section to hijab. She asks him, is it just, O son of the liberated, that your wives and your slave girls are behind a curtain, whilst the daughters of the Prophet of Allah be captives? You tore their veils, revealed their faces, drove them from town to town like enemies. You degraded them in the sight of the common people, and you made people look at them while their guardians and helpers were not with them. She walks in the footsteps of Bibi Maryam. She walks in the footsteps of her mother, Lady Fatima Zahra, in her emphasis and her establishment of the institution of hijab. And she is an incredible role model. And this is one of the areas where she is more relatable to the sisters in Islam. Because she breaks the stereotype. Sometimes there is this idea, this backwards concept, that a woman is submissive, that a woman is quiet, that a woman best keep her opinions to herself. Wal-'ayadu billah. Such abhorrent talk. But Bibi Zainab is the one who doesn't just stand up for herself in an ordinary circumstance. She stands up for the religion of Allah. She bears the burden of imamah while Imam Hussein had died and Imam Zainab al-Abidin was too sick. And she also delivers these sermons against whom? Against the most tyrannical and powerful men of her time. This is the lesson that we learn from her. And she adapts to the different circumstances. With her family, she is soft, she is kind, she is compassionate. In the court of Yazid, she is the eloquent speaker. On Sham-e Ghariba, she is the lion that protects her family. And in her silent moments, in her own reflection, she is the manifestation of tawakkul on this earth. These are the characteristics of Bibi Zainab. And she offers a consolation to Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam like no one else could. After the events of Karbala, she says, as is recorded in Kamil al-Ziyarat, when she refers to what had happened at Karbala, she says that in order to try and mitigate his pain, she says that they will gather the severed limbs and the bodies that are washed in blood, and they will bury them. And they will hoist a flag for your father in the land of Taf, such that its effects will never become old and its symbols will not disappear by the passage of time. Leaders of disbelief and misguidance will try and destroy it, but they will do nothing but increase the glory of his name.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And everyone here tonight, you are a testimony, you are a proof to these words of Bibi Zainab. We are more than 1,000 years after the tragedy of Karbala, a massacre in the middle of the desert, and every year we reunite and we remember those calamities that had happened, and we will never let the memory of Karbala be erased. She was escorted back to Medina eventually, and even when they got back to Medina, as is recorded in Maqtal al-Muqrim, that she tried to pay the people who helped them along. They didn't have any money with them because everything had been ransacked, everything had been taken, but she had some small amount of jewelry which she gathered from the women and tried to pay them. This is her akhlaq. Even at the end of all of her trials and tribulations, she does not forget her akhlaq. And she was seminal in the establishment of the sunnah of the Holy Prophet for crying for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. She established the majalis of Abu Abdullah. And she was so influential in Medina, eventually she had to move out. And some traditions say that she went to Egypt, some say that she went to Sham. But what is the legacy of Bibi Zainab? How do we summarize it? I could find no better way than what Dr. Binta Ashati says in Batla Karbala. She says that Zainab, Hussein's sister, destroyed the victory of Ibn Ziyad and Banu Umayyah, for she put drops of fatal poison in the goblets of the victors. And the political events that happened afterwards, like the revolt of Mukhtar, the revolt of Ibn Zubayr, the downfall of the Umayyads, the rise of the Abbasids, the strengthening and the establishment of the Shia school of thought, all of these were founded by Lady Zainab al-Kubra. That was the extent of her message, and she would go on and remember about Abdullah al-Hussein. She would tell the people about what happened, and she would recite about the events that she had seen on that day. Imam Hassan alayhi salam was the one who set up Karbala. Bibi Zainab was the one who established it afterwards.
Allahumma wa ali Muhammad.
Now, unfortunately, Bibi Zainab, she did not live very long after the events of Karbala, perhaps only a couple of years.